She crawled into his bed wearing almost nothing. Claiming it was an Apache ritual, he stayed silent. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
John Mercer returned to his cabin later than usual, the sky already darkening into a deep blue that signaled the temperature would drop hard before midnight. He had spent the entire day clearing debris along the north fence after a fallen tree split the line, and his shoulders ached from hauling wood. His horse snorted tiredly behind him as he led it into the small lean-to near the cabin. The animal nudged his sleeve once before lowering its head to drink from the trough, and John paused long enough to stroke its neck, reassuring it after a long day. John lived alone by choice. At 38, he had come to accept that the quiet worked better for him than conversation ever had. Years ago, when he worked as a scout for the Territorial Patrol, he made a single mistake during a raid, one he never spoke about, that cost innocent lives. Since then, he avoided people when possible, believing he protected them best by staying away. His only mission now was simple: keep his land maintained, stay out of trouble, and avoid situations that demanded more from him than he was prepared to give. He stepped into the cabin, expecting the same stillness he returned to every night. The lantern on the table burned with a low flame, casting thin light across the floor. He closed the door behind him, brushing snow from his coat, already thinking about warming water for coffee before sleep. That was when he felt it, a presence behind him. It wasn't a sound exactly, more the shift of air that happens when someone moves under covers. His entire body tightened. His hand drifted toward the rifle leaning near the stove, but he stopped when a faint, shaky breath reached his ears. He turned just enough to see the bed. A young woman lay curled near the center of it, her long black hair fanned across the pillow. Her clothing was torn almost beyond use, revealing patches of cold-reddened skin. She clutched the thin sheet to her chest, as if it were her last defense. Her face showed exhaustion so deep it bordered on collapse, and for a moment she didn't speak, uncertain of what his reaction would be. John didn't step closer. He stood still, examining every detail. Her trembling shoulders, her bare feet mottled from cold, the way she kept her knees drawn tight, as though protecting herself from something that might still be following her. She looked no older than her early 20s, worn thin from fear rather than age. Finally, she whispered, "I followed a ritual for safety. A woman may enter a man's sleeping place if she is threatened." Her voice cracked halfway through the explanation. She looked ready to bolt if he raised his voice or moved too quickly. John knew enough about Apache customs to understand that her words were not entirely false. Yet the panic in her eyes showed something else: desperation, not ceremony. He placed his gloves on the table slowly, showing he meant no harm. "You're freezing," he said in a low, steady voice. "You need warmth more than explanations." She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, trying to read whether he was dangerous. John walked to the foot of the bed with controlled movements. He picked up the thick quilt folded there and unfolded it carefully. She flinched at his closeness, though he didn't reach for her. He placed the blanket at the edge of the mattress and stepped back immediately so she had space to decide whether she trusted him. After a brief hesitation, she pulled the quilt over herself, her hands gripping it tightly. Her breathing stabilized in small increments. She kept her gaze lowered now, no longer speaking, as if conserving what little strength she had left. John felt the familiar pull of responsibility rise in his chest, an emotion he normally resisted. He wasn't looking for anyone to save, and he knew nothing about this woman's past or why she arrived half-dressed in a stranger's home. Yet leaving her outside would have been the same mistake he made once before, and he couldn't repeat it. He dragged the wooden chair near the stove and sat facing the firebox, making sure she could see his back rather than his face. It was the only way he knew to tell her she had nothing to fear from him. He listened to her breathing shift from short, frantic bursts in his slow, uneven sighs as the warmth began to reach her. Minutes turned into hours. One gust of wind rattled the shutters. She startled, lifting her head quickly. John didn't turn around, but he said, "Just the wind." He kept his voice even to anchor her. Her reaction told him more than her earlier explanation. Whoever chased her, or whatever she escaped, had pushed her past the point of thinking clearly. As the night stretched on, she stayed awake longer than he expected. At one point, she quietly asked, "You won't send me back?" "No," he answered. "Not tonight." She released a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. The quilt shifted slightly as she tried to get comfortable. John could tell she was in pain. There was a stiffness to the way she moved, and her hand hovered near her ribs as though bruised. His own thoughts pulled at him then. He wondered how she reached his land, how long she had been running, whether someone would come looking for her. He knew the questions mattered, but he also knew she didn't have the strength to answer them. Not yet. When dawn began to lighten the sky, John stood and stretched his stiff back. He poured warm water into a tin cup from a small pot on the stove and carried it to the bed, stopping a good distance away. "You should drink," he said. "It'll help." She pushed herself up slowly, still wrapped tightly in the quilt. Her hair fell forward over her shoulder, and she brushed it back with a trembling hand. She reached out, but her eyes watched him closely as if waiting for his intention to change at any second. She took a sip, then another. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. "What's your name?" he asked. "Taya," she whispered. John nodded once. "Rest, Taya. We'll talk when you're warm and steady." She studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decide if she could believe a man she had only seen in half-light. She finally nodded. John returned to the stove and opened the door. A wave of warm air hit him, and for the first time that night, he felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. He didn't know what came next, but he did know one thing with certainty. Whatever danger drove her here would not reach her as long as she remained under his roof. And for the first time in years, John felt his old instinct return. Not the violent, reactive one from his scouting days, but the steady, deliberate instinct that told him protecting her was the right thing to do. Even if he didn't yet understand why she had chosen his bed over any other place in the wilderness, he understood the weight of fear in someone's eyes. He had carried it once too. Taya closed her eyes with the quilt pulled tight, and John stood silently at the stove, keeping watch until the sun climbed fully over the horizon. The weak light of early morning filtered through the narrow cabin window, landing across the floor in a muted strip that revealed dust in the air and a thin trail of melted snow near the door where John had stepped in the night before. The room still held the heavy quiet of dawn, broken only by the crackle from inside the stove and the faint sound of Taya shifting beneath the quilt. John stood near the table, rolling his sleeves up as he prepared the morning fire. His movements were deliberate, careful not to startle the woman waking behind him. He placed a piece of split wood on the embers, watched it catch, and felt the warmth begin to build. His eyes drifted to the window for a moment. The sky outside was gray but clear, which meant he had a few hours to check the ridge before the next cloud front pressed in. Behind him, Taya slowly sat upright. She held the quilt against her chest, her breathing steady but cautious. She scanned the room, taking in every angle as if confirming she was truly alone with him and not in danger. The quiet between them had a different weight this morning, less frantic, more wary. John reached for a tin cup and poured warm water from the kettle. "You should drink again," he said without turning. His voice carried no command, only a steady patience. Taya accepted the cup with both hands. Her fingers wrapped tightly around it, and the steam fogged the air between them. She didn't sip immediately. She studied the floorboards, the stove, the coat hanging near the door, anything that explained where she was. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little," she answered, her tone soft but clearer than the night before. "The wind made it hard." John nodded. "Storm's passed. You'll feel warmer soon." She set the cup down on the table and pulled the quilt around her shoulders more securely. She looked healthier in the morning light, still exhausted, but not on the edge of collapse. Her hair fell loosely around her face, and she tucked a strand behind her ear with a steadying breath. "You didn't ask why I came here," she said. "You weren't ready to say," he replied, tying the stove latch. Taya looked toward the door, her expression tightening. I left people who won't be pleased to lose me. Are they close? John asked, not with alarm, but with the calm precision of a man who had learned to think ahead. I don't know, she admitted. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands. She wasn't just cold. She was recounting something she wanted to forget. John didn't press her. He knew the signs of someone pushed past endurance. He also knew that what she didn't say mattered more than what she had spoken. A woman didn't flee half-dressed in freezing weather unless she was desperate. He stepped toward the shelves and retrieved a folded shirt, one of his old ones, worn from years of use but clean. It's not much, he said, placing it on the edge of the bed, but it will help until we fix something better. Taya hesitated. Accepting clothing from a man could mean many things in her world. But John's eyes stayed steady, giving no indication of expectation. She reached for the shirt with slow fingers and clutched it to her chest. Thank you, she said quietly. While she changed behind the hanging blanket near the corner, John stepped outside to give her privacy. The cold hit him sharply, the kind that stiffened hands even through gloves. He scanned the tree line, listening for movement. Nothing but the wind in the pines. He took a few steps to check the trough and noticed faint prints near the edge, older than last night's storm, but enough to remind him that someone had passed through recently. He filed the detail away without comment. When he returned, Taya was standing near the stove, John's shirt hanging loosely over her frame. She looked more composed, though she avoided his gaze. She had arranged the quilt neatly on the bed, an unspoken effort to show respect for his space. You should eat something, he said, gesturing to the small loaf of cornbread on the table. She broke off a small piece and forced herself to chew. The food steadied her, but her eyes stayed distant. John watched her for a moment, weighing his next words. I'll need to check the ridge soon. It's the only way to know if anyone followed you. Her breath caught slightly. You'll leave me alone? Not for long, he assured. If there's danger, I want to know early. Taya stepped closer, uncertainty written plainly on her face. If you see tracks, what will you do? John tightened the strap on his gear. Come back. That's all. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Relief, thin but real, crossed her features. She moved to the window while he prepared his horse. Her hand rested lightly on the frame, and for the first time she allowed herself to look beyond the fear, toward the land, the sky, and the man who had offered her shelter without asking anything in return. Before he stepped out, John paused at the door. You'll be safe here. Lock the door behind me and keep the stove warm. She nodded. I'll wait. John closed the door gently, leaving her in the quiet glow of the cabin, the place that had become her refuge for reasons neither of them had spoken aloud yet. The morning carried a strange new steadiness, fragile, untested, but present. And as he walked into the cold, Taya watched him from the window, her fingers pressed lightly against the glass, knowing that whatever happened next would shape the life she had no choice but to rebuild. Warmth filled the cabin slowly that morning, spreading from the stove outward as Taya moved through the small space with careful steps. She kept her hands close to her body, still unsure what she was allowed to touch, yet determined not to sit idle. The shirt John had given her hung long on her frame, brushing against her thighs when she walked. Each movement revealed how she was testing the boundaries of this unfamiliar safety. John returned from the ridge after nearly an hour, brushing dirt from his boots as he stepped through the door. He didn't announce himself. He simply set his hat on the peg and let the quiet settle. Taya looked up from the floor where she'd been arranging the few tools she had found scattered near the trunk. She straightened immediately, worried she had overstepped. You can leave those, John said, placing his gloves on the table. I'll sort them later. I wanted to make the space tidy, she replied, her voice steady but cautious. It's fine, he answered, with no irritation, only simple acknowledgement. Do whatever helps you feel settled. The permission surprised her. She nodded, keeping her gaze low. John removed his coat and stepped toward the basin, splashing cold water over his hands and face. The sting of it sharpened his thoughts. He had seen faint signs along the ridge, broken brush, shallow impressions in the dirt, but nothing fresh enough to mean immediate danger. Still, the knowledge stayed with him, a quiet reminder that someone could return. Behind him, Taya moved to the stove and stirred the pot she had placed there earlier. She had used leftover beans and dried vegetables she found in a small sack, creating something simple but warm. When she ladled a portion into two bowls, she waited, unsure where he preferred to sit. John pulled out his usual chair and sat with a faint stiffness in his back. "You can take the other." Taya joined him, sitting with straight posture, her eyes lifting only to gauge whether he approved of her cooking. He took a spoonful without saying anything at first. Then he swallowed, wiped his mouth with his thumb, and nodded. "It's good." The brief praise loosened the tension in her shoulders. She took her first bite slowly, careful not to eat too quickly despite how hungry she felt. Silence filled the table, but it wasn't pressing. It was a quiet space where both tried to understand each other without asking direct questions. After the meal, she carried the bowls to the basin and washed them with efficient, practiced motions. John retrieved a cracked hatchet from the corner and sat near the door to repair its handle. The rhythm of their tasks created a kind of unspoken pattern, two people working separately but inside the same steady rhythm. Taya watched him occasionally from the corner of her eye. She noted the way his hands moved, firm but controlled. He worked with a focus that suggested he preferred tasks over talk. His silence didn't feel dismissive. It felt like something he used to keep his thoughts from drifting into places he didn't want to revisit. When he noticed her watching, he paused. "If you need something, say so." "I was wondering how long you've lived alone," she said carefully. 8 years, he answered. "Long enough to get used to it." "Do you want to stay alone?" she asked, immediately regretting the boldness of the question. John tightened the clamp on the handle before replying. "It was simple that way, but simple isn't always best." She absorbed that quietly. It wasn't a confession, but it told her more than she expected him to reveal. Later, she approached him with a torn strap from the bundle of her belongings. "Can you fix this?" she asked. He examined the leather, nodding once. "I'll do it this afternoon." "Thank you." Her gratitude startled him more than he let show. He had spent so many years interacting with people only in brief exchanges, trades, passing conversations, supply trips, that hearing appreciation spoken with genuine relief stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Outside, the wind had died, leaving the land unervingly still. John stepped out to check the horse while Taya swept the floor with a branch broom she fashioned from dried sticks. She worked methodically, grounding herself in the simple routine. John returned to see her kneeling beside the bed, folding the quilt neatly. He cleared his throat to announce his presence. "You don't have to clean everything." "I need to do something," she replied. "If I stay still, my thoughts become loud." He understood that more than he wanted to admit. He set the repaired strap on the table. "This will hold." She examined it, touching the stitching with cautious fingers. "It looks new. It'll last," he said. As afternoon light filtered through the window, they settled into small tasks again. John sharpening tools on a flat stone, while Taya arranged basic ingredients on the shelf, preparing for the next meal. She hummed quietly to herself, a soft sound she quickly stopped when she realized he could hear. "You can keep doing that," he said without looking up. "Doesn't bother me." Her expression softened. "It helps me stay calm." He didn't comment further, but the faint curve at the corner of his mouth showed he didn't mind the presence of something gentle inside the cabin. By dusk, they had created a rhythm without ever discussing it. She tended the fire. He checked the locks. She arranged their corner of supplies. He prepared the lantern for the night. Taya watched him as he moved through the cabin with sure, practiced steps. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or whether danger still followed her, but she recognized something solid in the man across the room, a steadiness she had never known in any place she'd lived. And as he set his tools aside and glanced toward the window, she felt, for the first time in months, that her future might not be decided by fear alone. The evening ended without ceremony, but something quiet had shifted in the space they shared. Two strangers had begun acting like people who trusted each other, if only through tasks, glances, and the slow, cautious acceptance that they were no longer alone. The sun had not yet lifted fully above the ridge when Taya stepped outside, clutching a small bundle of firewood against her chest. The cold bit at her ankles, but she welcomed the feeling. It grounded her in the moment, reminding her she was no longer running through the dark. Frost still clung to the porch boards, and her breath formed thin clouds as she moved. John was already in the yard, kneeling beside the broken fence rail he intended to replace. He had a hammer tucked into his belt and a handful of nails in his coat pocket. His focus stayed on the wood in front of him, but he glanced up briefly when he sensed her approach. "You're awake early," he said, standing with a faint stiffness in his knees. "You start before sunrise," she replied, placing the wood near the door. "I thought I should as well." He wiped sawdust from his hands. "No rule about that." "Still," she said, looking toward the trail leading into the trees, "it feels better to move." John recognized the look in her eyes, worry mixed with vigilance. She wasn't scanning the land for beauty. She was checking for danger. He followed her gaze for a moment, scanning the trees with the same calm precision he used every day. Nothing stirred except the weak morning wind. Inside, Taya began sweeping the floor with the branch broom she'd made. The rhythmic scrape against the boards brought a strange steadiness to her breathing. While she worked, John brought in the rail he'd cut and leaned it near the wall to warm before installation. His boots left faint trails of dirt on the planks, which she swept without complaint. He watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she avoided sudden movements and kept her back close to the stove. She wasn't hiding. She was keeping obstacles at her sides where she could see them. He understood that instinct too well. "Taya," he said, setting his tools on the table, "something's weighing on you today." She paused with the broom midair. Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was guarded, yet something in her eyes suggested she no longer wanted to carry everything alone. "I didn't tell you the truth that first night," she said, holding the broom tightly. "I figured there was more," John replied quietly. "I wasn't following any ritual. I said it because I needed a reason to stay inside." Her voice wavered but didn't break. "If I admitted the real reason, I thought you might push me back out." John leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "You came here because you had nowhere else to go." She nodded slowly. "I escaped a man I did not choose. His family believes I belong to them. I refused, and they decided to punish me. I ran before they could finish what they started." John's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "You were right to leave." Taya swallowed hard. "I didn't know where else to run. I followed the cold until my legs failed. When I saw your cabin lights, I thought maybe someone inside would show mercy." "You made the right choice," he said again, firmer this time. She lowered the broom, letting it rest against the wall. The tension in her shoulders eased, but the fear that had driven her across the frontier still lingered in her posture. John walked to the window and checked the horizon out of habit. The land was open, quiet, and unchanged. "No one's close," he said, "but that doesn't mean they won't try again." She stepped beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "If you want me gone, I will leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your home." He turned to her fully. "You don't bring trouble. Trouble comes from men who can't accept a woman's decisions." Her breath shook with relief, a small, barely audible sigh that escaped before she could stop it. Her shoulders lowered as if she had finally released a weight she had carried since crossing the tree line the night she arrived. After a moment of silence, she whispered, "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," John answered. "Just keep yourself warm and eat." "That's enough." She nodded. It wasn't gratitude that softened her expression. It was the rare feeling of being believed without question. Later, while John repaired the fence outside, Taya prepared a simple meal with careful precision, stirring the pot with a steady hand. The cabin smelled of dried herbs and simmering broth. She tasted it once, adjusted the seasoning, and moved the pot to the warmer part of the stove when she heard John's footsteps approaching the door. When he entered, she placed a full bowl in front of him. "I made extra," she said, "if you're hungry." He sat, lifting a spoon without hesitation. "Smells good." Taya didn't eat until he took the first bite. Only then did she settle into her chair. She watched his reaction with subtle expectation, not for praise, but for reassurance that she belonged here long enough to finish the meal. John looked up once, meeting her eyes. "It's real good," he said. Her chest lifted with a slow breath, not from pride, but from the comfort of knowing she wouldn't be turned away today. As the day settled into quieter tasks, both of them found a rhythm again, different from the day before, deeper, more trusting. Taya folded blankets and sorted supplies. John stacked new firewood and checked the outer trail. Neither spoke much, yet something important had shifted. She had offered her truth, and he had accepted it without hesitation, anchoring a fragile foundation neither of them had expected to build. The following morning carried a sharper cold, the kind that stiffened the ground and left a thin crust of frost across every surface. John stepped outside first, pulling his coat tight as he headed toward the woodpile. The sky was pale and still, offering no sign of snow, yet the air felt heavy enough to promise a change. He split several logs with steady swings, the repetitive motion clearing his thoughts. Inside the cabin, Taya folded the blanket she had slept under and placed it neatly at the foot of the bed. She moved with more confidence than the day before, no longer flinching at every creak of the floorboards. She approached the stove and fed it new wood, watching the flames rise with a quiet steadiness. The warmth soothed her hands, easing a soreness she had carried for days. When John returned, he brushed frost from his sleeves and noticed how she stood tall, near the stove rather than tucked into a corner. He nodded once, acknowledging the small change. She offered him a faint smile, careful but genuine. "You were gone longer than usual," she said. "Check the fence line," he replied, setting the logs in the storage box. Wind knocked a section loose. "Did you fix it?" "For now. I'll reinforce it later." Her eyes lingered on his hands, red from the cold, marked by work, yet steady. She recognized the kind of endurance that came from long seasons alone. After a moment, she reached for the kettle. "I warmed water. You should drink before it cools." John accepted the cup without comment. The heat spread through his fingers, grounding him in the present. He watched her move around the small table, organizing supplies and adjusting the pot she had set to boil. There was no hesitation in her gestures today. She behaved like someone who trusted her surroundings enough to touch things without fear. While she worked, he noticed a faint bruise near her ribs as the shirt shifted when she stretched to reach a jar on the shelf. Her breath hitched briefly, and she placed a hand over the tender spot. John set the cup down, his gaze sharpening. "You're hurting," he said. "It's fading," she murmured, lowering her arm. "It happened when I ran. You should rest when it aches." "I can rest later," she replied. "I need to be useful now." John studied her face, firm jaw, steady eyes, a hint of stubborn pride. He recognized someone who would rather work through pain than sit with her thoughts. He didn't press further. They ate a simple breakfast in silence, each bite measured. The quiet wasn't strained. It felt like a shared pause before the day settled into motion. When the dishes were washed, Taya stepped outside with him. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching a flock of dark birds circle over the valley before drifting away. "This place is quiet," she said softly. "Different from anywhere I've lived." John adjusted the saddle straps on his horse. "Quiet helps. For you?" "For most people," he replied. "Noise makes decisions harder." She looked at him, then truly looked, seeing not just a rancher, but a man who had built his life around order, careful choices, and routines that gave him control over the past he never spoke about. Taya moved closer, her steps slow. "You don't ask many questions. You answer when you're ready," he said, tightening the final strap. A breath escaped her, steady, relieved. It was the first time she allowed herself to simply stand beside him without holding her arms tight or glancing over her shoulder. Later, she positioned herself beside the trough, cleaning old buckets with a rag she dampened in fresh water. John repaired the railing nearby, glancing at her periodically. She caught him once, and he didn't look away. A brief exchange passed between them, quiet understanding, not embarrassment. When she finished, she walked back toward the cabin, passing him with slow steps. "If you ever need help with work outside, you can tell me," she said. "You already help," he answered, lifting the last board into place. "I mean real help," she added, stopping a few feet away. I've carried more weight than people think. John gave her a long, considering look. All right, he said. I'll remember that. The afternoon settled into a pattern neither had agreed upon, but both accepted. She prepared stew, chopping dried meat into small pieces while humming softly under her breath. John cleaned tools by the door, checking each handle for cracks. The domestic rhythm felt oddly natural. For him, a rare sense of comfort. For her, a rare sense of belonging. As dusk crept in, Taya stepped outside one last time. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stared at the ridge. Shadows stretched across the land, sharp and unmoving. John joined her on the porch, standing beside her without speaking. Do you think they'll come for me? She asked, keeping her eyes on the horizon. Not today, he answered. I'd see signs. And tomorrow? We'll face it when tomorrow comes. The directness of his tone steadied her. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. He wasn't claiming he could fend off every threat. He was simply stating that he would be there when danger appeared. She nodded slowly. It's strange to feel safe. You're allowed to, he replied. They lingered there until the last light faded. Then Taya stepped back inside, and John followed, closing the door gently behind them both. The day ended without argument or fear, replaced instead by a quiet connection neither had expected. Steady, respectful, and growing stronger with every hour they shared the same roof. John woke before the first trace of daylight, his instincts nudging him out of bed with the same quiet urgency that had guided him through years of scouting. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness of the cabin. Taya slept on the opposite side of the room, curled beneath a blanket, her breathing steady. The faint glow from the stove cast a soft line of light along her cheek, showing a calmness he hadn't seen on her face until recently. He stood, pulled on his boots, and reached for his coat. He didn't announce his departure. He rarely spoke at this hour. Before stepping out, he paused long enough to glance at her one more time. She looked peaceful, and that alone gave him enough reason to be cautious today. Outside, the air carried a brittle chill. Frost cracked beneath his feet as he crossed the yard, heading toward the horse standing quietly near the trough. He saddled the animal with practiced efficiency and mounted, steering it toward the narrow trail leading up the ridge. The horizon was still dark, with a faint ribbon of silver suggesting dawn on its way. Taya woke to the sound of the door latch falling back into place. She sat up abruptly, briefly disoriented before remembering where she was. Pulling the blanket around her shoulders, she moved toward the stove, feeding it more wood until the flames regained strength. The warmth steadied her nerves, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. She waited, listening, unsure when he would return. John rode slowly along the rising slope, scanning the ground for disturbances. Each indentation in the earth mattered. A broken twig, a displaced stone, the imprint of a boot. He dismounted at a narrow bend where the soil was soft from yesterday's frost, crouching to examine the tracks more closely. There were marks he didn't like. Not new, but not old enough to ignore. The prints suggested two riders, light horses, moving parallel to his property but circling wider than typical travelers. He brushed dirt between his fingers, gauging how long ago the tracks had been made. A day, maybe less, he muttered under his breath. His thoughts shifted immediately to Taya. She had been honest about being pursued, but the men following her weren't fools. If they tracked her well enough, they might trace her direction, maybe not to the cabin yet, but close enough to test the surroundings. John stood, tightening the reins. He didn't let fear drive him. Instead, a measured sense of responsibility settled into his posture. He had taken her in, whether he intended it or not. Her safety now rested in his decisions. Back at the cabin, Taya prepared a pot of hot water and laid out the shirt she had washed earlier. She moved through the space with an anxious rhythm, wiping surfaces, checking the door, adjusting her hair. Each task was smaller than the fear inside her, but finishing them gave her a sense of control. Her mind churned with questions she didn't want to voice. With the men, she fled close. Had John seen anything? Would he tell her if he had? She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her breath steady out of sheer determination. Whatever happened, she wasn't the helpless woman who had collapsed in his bed days ago. She could stand now. She could think. She could choose. The sound of hooves approached thin, slow, measured. She hurried to the window, tension locking her jaw. Her breath eased when she recognized John's silhouette approaching through the cold morning light. He dismounted and tied the horse loosely near the gate before stepping inside. His face carried no alarm, but she sensed a shift in him, a readiness, a focus sharper than usual. "You went to the ridge," she said, reading him carefully. "I did," he replied, removing his gloves. "Saw some tracks." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Fresh. Fresh enough," he said. "Two riders. They weren't heading straight here, but they're on the right line." Fear flickered across her features, but she pressed it down quickly. "They're searching. Looks that way." She took a step toward him, then stopped, unsure how close she was allowed to stand when speaking about something so personal. "If they come, you don't have to. I know what I'm doing," John interrupted gently. "And I wouldn't tell you to leave even if I didn't." She blinked, absorbing the weight of his certainty. John continued, setting his hat on the peg. "I'll keep checking the ridge and the south trail tomorrow. We'll stay aware." "We?" she asked, surprised he included her. "You're part of this now," he said. The simple statement hit her harder than she expected. She had been treated like a burden for so long that being acknowledged as part of anything, especially part of someone's life, felt like stepping on unfamiliar ground. She swallowed hard. "I don't want to cause you trouble." "You didn't cause anything," he said. "People made choices. You made yours." A quiet beat passed between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. John sat at the table then, rubbing warmth into his hands while she poured hot water into a cup and set it in front of him. He accepted it with a short nod, and their eyes met briefly. Taya realized then that he wasn't just offering her refuge. He was preparing himself to stand between her and whatever threatened her. His calmness wasn't indifference, it was commitment. She exhaled, feeling her body loosen for the first time that morning. "I'll keep watch at the window today," she said. "I know how to spot movement from far off." "Good," he replied. "We'll keep a steady routine, but we'll stay sharp." As the hours passed, the cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It had become a place where decisions mattered, where two people who had lived in silence for years found themselves acting as a quiet team. By afternoon, the fear that haunted Taya still lingered, but it no longer consumed her. John's presence anchored her, not with promises, but with actions. And as dusk approached, the land around them seemed both more threatening and more manageable, because now, neither of them faced it alone. The next morning arrived without wind, leaving the cabin wrapped in a muted silence that felt almost unnatural for the open frontier. Even the pines behind the property stood still, their branches barely shifting. John stepped outside first, scanning the tree line with the same cautious focus he'd relied on for years. Nothing moved except a thin curtain of mist beginning to lift from the ground. Taya watched him from the doorway, holding a folded cloth between her hands. Something in his stance reassured her, the quiet authority of a man who understood danger but didn't let fear dictate his moves. He walked back to her with relaxed shoulders, the early light soft against his face. "Clear for now," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. She nodded, stepping aside as he entered the cabin. She had spent the past hour tidying the shelves, arranging dried herbs, sorting the tools she felt confident handling, and stacking tinder near the stove. The small space looked more lived in now, less like the home of a lone man and more like a place two people inhabited. "You've been busy," John remarked, noticing the organized supplies. "I needed the cabin to feel steady," she replied. "It helps me think." He understood that completely. Taya moved toward the table, laying out the cloth she'd been carrying, a simple square of deerskin she had cleaned and softened. "I want to make something useful," she said. "Maybe a small pouch for your nails or matches." John leaned against the counter, watching her fingers work the leather with growing confidence. She had a careful precision about her, each movement firm yet gentle, as though she was rebuilding skills she hadn't been allowed to use in a long time. While she stitched, John repaired the latch on the back door. The steady clink of his tools mixed with the soft scrape of her needle, creating a quiet rhythm that seemed to settle the air inside the cabin. Neither spoke for several minutes, yet nothing about the silence felt empty. When John finished, he stepped outside to fetch more wood. Taya followed a moment later, carrying a rag to wipe soot from the stovepipe. They didn't coordinate their tasks, but their actions aligned naturally. She worked while he worked, each finding ways to support the other's efforts. At midday, Taya prepared a meal of dried meat and thick broth. When she handed John a bowl, he noticed her hands weren't trembling anymore. She sat across from him, posture straight, eyes steady. They ate in companionable quiet, both aware that the rhythm of their days had begun to resemble something more than survival. After the meal, John moved to the yard to repair the trough. Taya joined him without asking. She picked up fallen branches, cleared debris around the posts, and carried tools from the cabin when he needed them. Her presence didn't slow him down. Her movements had purpose. At one point, she knelt beside the trough and scrubbed the inside with a rough cloth, pushing away residue that had built up during the storm. John paused and watched her for a moment. Her focused expression, her determined motions, the faint tension in her jaw when she pushed through discomfort. "You don't have to work this hard," he said. "I don't know how to sit still anymore," she answered. "When I stop, the past chases me." He considered her words. "Then keep moving. Just don't wear yourself down." She gave him a brief, grateful look. Later, they walked back toward the cabin together. The door creaked softly as John held it open for her. Taya hesitated at the threshold, taking in the room before entering. Something had shifted inside her, a small recognition that this place now held parts of her too. Inside, she placed a finished leather pouch on the table. "For your things," she said, pushing it gently toward him. John picked it up and examined the stitching. The work was clean and strong. "This is good," he said. "Real good." A faint flush touched her cheeks, and she lowered her eyes. She wasn't used to praise, especially from a man who rarely wasted words. By dusk, the sky deepened into a clear, dark blue. John lit the lantern, filling the cabin with a warm glow that softened the edges of the room. Taya sat on the bed, braiding her hair slowly while watching him adjust the lamp wick. Her posture was relaxed, her features calm. "You check the ridge tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "I will," he said. "But tonight we rest." Her braids slipped on her shoulder, and she nodded with quiet trust. She removed her shoes and settled under the blanket, not out of fear, but because she felt anchored here in a way she hadn't expected when she had first stumbled into his home. John sat in his chair near the stove, soaking in the heat and letting the weariness of the day settle in his bones. He watched her only briefly, just long enough to see that she no longer fought sleep. As her breathing slowed, the cabin felt full in a way it never had before. Not crowded, simply lived in. A quiet house had shifted into something else. A place of two people who no longer felt like intruders in each other's lives, but necessary parts of the same, unfolding routine. For the first time in years, John wondered what tomorrow might look like with someone waiting when he returned. The morning arrived with a low, colorless sky stretching across the valley, the kind that signaled cold without wind. John rose early, stretching the stiffness from his arms before lighting the stove. The fire caught quickly, illuminating the cabin in a muted orange glow. Taya slept on her side, her braid half undone, one hand resting lightly near her chin. She looked calmer than she had since the moment they met. John stepped outside to check the yard. The ground felt firm beneath his boots, and the air held a biting edge. He walked to the trough, broke the thin layer of ice with a stick, and scanned the ridge automatically. Nothing moved. No tracks. No shadows out of place. For the first time in days, the land felt still enough to breathe. Inside, Taya stirred awake. She blinked at the ceiling for a moment before realizing John was already gone. The cabin carried his presence in subtle ways. The way the wood was stacked neatly near the stove, the smell of smoke drifting softly through the room, the faint scrape of boots near the door from his earlier steps. She stood, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and walked to the window. When she saw him return from the yard, she felt a small, surprising sense of relief. She hadn't expected to grow dependent on the sight of him, yet his steady form crossing the clearing anchored her in a way she couldn't dismiss. When he stepped inside, she noticed he looked more relaxed than usual. "Ridge is clear," John said, pulling off his gloves. "For now," she replied, though there was no fear in her tone this time. He nodded, then sat at the table to tighten a seam on his coat. The stitching had come loose near the shoulder, and he worked the needle slowly, his hands steady. Taya approached him, watching the thread slip through the fabric. "You mend things with patience," she said softly. "Learn to take my time," he answered. "Rushing just makes mistakes." She hesitated before taking the seat across from him. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table as she gathered the courage to speak. "I've been thinking." He didn't look up, but she knew she had his full attention. "You said I'm part of this now," she continued. "Part of whatever happens next." "That's right." Her eyes shifted toward the door, then back to him. "I don't want to run again. I'm tired of waking up expecting someone to take me away." "You're safe here," John said firmly. "No one comes through this land without me knowing." She nodded, but a deeper question pressed at her ribs. "John, if I stay here, not just for a few days, but for good, would that trouble you?" He set the coat aside and leaned forward slightly. His expression didn't shift dramatically, but something softened behind his eyes. "Why are you asking that?" "Because I don't want shelter only," she said. "I want a place where I can stand without fear. A place that feels like mine too." She paused. "And I don't want to feel like a burden you took in out of duty." "You're not a burden," he said without hesitation. "You never were." The firmness in his voice made her chest tighten. She hadn't expected him to speak with such certainty. Taya rose from the table, walked slowly to the bed, and picked up the small leather tie she had finished the night before. She approached him again, stopping close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She held out the tie. "I made this for you to see me, not just the frightened woman who arrived here half frozen." He took the tie in his hand, rubbing the smooth surface with his thumb. The craftsmanship was careful, each stitch deliberate. "I do see you," he murmured. She looked directly at him now. "Then let me stay." John didn't answer immediately. He exhaled, long and controlled, as if acknowledging the weight of her request. He had lived alone for so many years that letting someone into his home and into his daily routines was no small step. But everything she had shown him since her arrival, the steadiness, the effort, the quiet loyalty, had already begun shaping the cabin into something different. "Stay," he said finally. "If that's what you want, then stay." She didn't smile, not fully. Instead, she released a breath that trembled with relief. She stepped closer, carefully, giving him room to move away if he chose. He didn't. "Thank you," she whispered. Later, as dusk drew across the land, Taya prepared the bed while John secured the windows and checked the locks. She laid the quilt neatly, smoothing the corners with slow, deliberate hands. When he approached, she looked up at him with quiet confidence. "Will you sit with me?" she asked. He removed his coat and took a seat at the edge of the bed. The lantern light softened the lines of his face, making him appear less burdened. Taya slid beneath the blanket, leaving space for him. "Not because I'm afraid," she said, "but because tonight feels different." John lay beside her carefully, leaving a respectful distance at first. She closed that gap gently, resting her head against his shoulder. He didn't pull away, only adjusted his position so she rested comfortably. The room held no tension, only a calm understanding. For the first time since her arrival, Taya slept not from exhaustion, but from feeling wanted. And John, after years of empty nights, allowed himself to rest beside someone without fear of losing the quiet he'd worked so hard to build. The sun rose slowly over the ridge, casting a steady band of light across the clearing as John stepped outside to check the land one final time before settling into whatever came next. The air held a crisp bite, but the sky was clear, promising a calm day. He surveyed every direction, the tree line, the dry creek bed, the distant slope where he had tracked riders days ago. Nothing moved. No prints marked the soil. No sound carried on the wind except the faint creak of his own boots. For the first time since Taya had arrived, he felt a sense of certainty settle into his chest. The men who hunted her had either turned back or lost her trail entirely. They were not coming. He walked back toward the cabin, noticing how smoke curled gently from the chimney. A small thing, but it struck him how different that smoke felt today. It meant someone was inside, tending warmth, waiting for him, not as a burden, but as a partner. When he opened the door, Taya stood near the stove, stirring a pot of morning broth. Her braid hung straight down her back, and the deerskin shirt she had adjusted herself fit her comfortably now. She turned toward him, her expression open and steady. "You're earlier than usual," she said. "Didn't need much time," John answered, hanging his coat on the peg. "The ridge is quiet. No tracks. No riders." Her breath released in a slow, controlled exhale, not fear, but relief finally finding space. "So it's over?" she asked, voice soft but firm. "As far as I can tell," he said. "We're safe." The word we lingered in the air. She noticed it, and her gaze softened in a way that felt like a new beginning rather than a fragile moment. Taya moved toward the table, placing 2 bowls down and filling them. She wasn't tentative in her motions anymore. Her steps carried a confidence that had grown naturally from the days they spent working, eating, and breathing the same air. John sat across from her, and for the first time, they ate without silence weighed by uncertainty. Instead, their quiet felt comfortable, shared, steady, familiar. Taya glanced toward the window and then toward him. "What happens now?" she asked, not with anxiety, but with genuine curiosity. John considered her question carefully. "We build a life here," he said. "Together, if you want that." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked toward the small wooden shelf she'd organized days earlier, and retrieved the leather tie she had made for him. She placed it gently on the table between them. "I didn't make this only so you'd see me," she admitted in a calm voice. "I made it because I wanted to stay in a place where my hands mattered, where I wasn't just hiding." John lifted the tie, turning it slowly in his fingers. The stitching was tight, consistent, work done by someone who cared about precision and effort. He set it down carefully, then rose from his chair. He approached her with slow, steady steps. "Your hands matter here," he said quietly. "Your presence matters here." Taya looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the steady flame of the stove. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't bracing for disappointment. She stood grounded, strong, certain. "Then I want to stay," she said. "I choose this. I choose you. Not because I need safety now, but because I feel whole in this place." John let the words settle deeply before responding. "I want you here," he said. "Not out of obligation, not out of rescue, because this house feels alive with you in it." A quiet warmth spread between them, subtle, real, and entirely theirs. Later that afternoon, they worked outside together, reinforcing the fence line not out of fear, but practical preparation for the season. Taya handed John tools as he hammered new rails into place. Their movements fell into perfect alignment, an unspoken partnership built through days of shared labor and mutual respect. When the sun dipped low, lighting the valley in soft amber, they stood on the porch looking over the land. Taya's shawl brushed lightly against John's arm, and instead of stepping away, she moved closer. "It's peaceful here," she said. "It will stay that way," John replied, shifting just enough so their shoulders touched. That evening, as lantern light filled the cabin, Taya folded her blanket across the foot of the bed, no longer uncertain about her place. John extinguished the lantern and lay beside her, settling in as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to keep one eye open while she slept. She trusted the walls around her. She trusted the man beside her even more. "We're home now," she whispered into the dark. "Yes," John said softly. "We are." The room settled into stillness, steady, warm, complete. 2 lives that once moved alone now shaped a shared world, built not through grand words or forced vows, but through the quiet certainty of choosing to stay. And in that simple, grounded truth, their story found its lasting peace.